Hi, and welcome to Experiential Realism. It's a pleasure to welcome back Professor Philip Clayton, a philosopher of religion and science. The last time we spoke on the show, Professor Clayton and I engaged in a dialectic about consciousness studies, where we touched upon theology. And today we're going to be discussing God and a theological concept known as Imago Dei, or Imago Dei, as the anglicized pronunciation goes. It's Latin for image of God. Without further ado, here's Professor Philip Clayton. Hi, Professor Philip Clayton. Welcome to the show. The last time we
Thanks
talked
for having
about,
me back, Arlindo.
yeah, no problem. It's an honor. It's a pleasure to be engaging in this dialectic with you about consciousness studies and mentioning theological topics. And Uh, just before I hit record, you were telling me about AI and how people are interested in whether or not it's conscious, and perhaps you can lead with that, and we can go from there, and then
Yeah,
we can expand our horizons and see where we go.
I like your beginning that way, Arlindo, because consciousness studies is often taken as a niche thing, and especially consciousness studies connected with experiential realism and classic metaphysical questions, sometimes theological questions. But now everybody's talking about consciousness, so nobody can say it's niche thing. This book by Michael Pollan just appeared. Actually, it's called A World Appears, A Journey into Consciousness. And it's getting a lot of reviews, and he's appearing on these talk shows, and everybody's um, concerned about it. So a lot of street philosophy, at least in the US, but I think in Britain as well, is saying, well, AI, now we have consciousness running on not on wet matter, but on in silicon, and we have a whole new approach. And LLM gives us a thinking being in some sense, and it's only a matter of time, right? Dot dot dot. You know where that's going. And
Let's see.
Michael Pollan has just offered devastating arguments against that. Uh, he was just on the Terry Gross On Being show, National Public Radio in the US. So hundreds of thousands of people have listened to it and talked about it. And he basically says, we're surprised that sentience and maybe some kind of awareness goes below the human in the natural world. So higher primates, that's often held further on down the ladder chain. And then the first chapter of this book on A World Appears is about plants. And he says, here are some arguments to see plants as sentient as well. Whether they're conscious, which is a further step along the route, is unclear. But there's no reason to think that the programs we write, so these large language models, LLMs, have anything like consciousness, much less, as Claude has been claimed about Claude, moral agency or the right to be considered as agents on the same moral level as we are. And it's so many people are passionately debating this question that I think we can't talk about consciousness in our broader sense without acknowledging that that battle is going on. And in a sense, I would ask, well, what if we were wrong? You and I were wrong, and we do need to ascribe consciousness outside of the biological world. How would that change the flavor of our conversation? Or is that even just not even a credible idea to you?
Right. When it comes to Colin, right, I'm going to have to look into his work actually because it piques my interest. When he makes a distinction between sentience and consciousness, I tend to think how I conceptualize sentience is a rudimentary form of consciousness because it's something that's still felt. You know, like when you touch a hot stove and your hand moves away from it, there's no thinking involved. But I think something is felt which makes us recoil without having to think, but it's something that's still there. Um, so I tend to think that consciousness exists uh, in primordial systems, and maybe complexity does something to it and shape it in a certain way, or it's a reflect, or maybe the complexity that we observe in certain organisms is a reflection of what consciousness is doing, or how consciousness appears to us from a second or third person perspective. Um, and I tend to think of living organisms um, as a kind of holarchy, where the cells are holons, they're parts of the whole, but they're still wholes in themselves because they're made up of organelles, and then we can extrapolate from that. Um, and the cell in itself represents the entire organism. If the entire organism is coded in the cell, so I'm thinking in terms of life, conscious life being usually manifesting as a biological holarchy. And when it comes to AI, we don't see that. Each part of, say, a machine doesn't necessarily represent the whole, or
Yeah.
it's a part in and of itself. So I'm thinking that perhaps with humans and animals and perhaps plants, sentient life, we could be talking about some kind of Markov blanket. Um, where if you remove one of the parts, it can still continue, it can still go on, but if you remove vital parts, then it's no longer uh, a focused consciousness, a consciousness unit,
Hmm.
let's say. Um, it might blend in with the rest of the mind of nature, perhaps, if we're talking about an idealistic picture. So I would disagree with say panpsychism, constitutive panpsychism. Um, that's my current position at the moment. I'm open
Hmm.
to have my mind changed about that.
So it's interesting how you set up the question. Um, but first, let me express my agreement. There isn't in any kind of artificial intelligence the hold-on phenomenon, which arguably is present in cases of natural world consciousness.
Yeah,
And the other difference that Michael Pollan points out against the AI as conscious argument is that they use the software hardware distinction, so which obviously makes sense in computing machines, claiming then that our brains are the hardware and the thoughts, the activity in the brain is the software. But actually, as Poland points out, our brains are molded by our own experience. It's not just that the software changes, but the hardware is also changing as well. So the
yeah.
brain mind, the brain consciousness is a much more holistic phenomenon, which is the second argument against them. So now let's just set that off because that was just enough, I guess, to get us warmed up. And I'll come back to the interesting way that you maybe that we define things in the opposite way and yet are trying to say the same thing. So you begin it with consciousness as the base phenomenon, and then consciousness takes many forms, such as a simple consciousness is sentience. And other people might say, so as an emergentist approaching this question of experiential realism, I start with a new emergent level with its certain forms, a new emergent level with its particular forms. So I think of sentience as coming earlier in the evolutionary process. It's an awareness that is not yet consciousness, and then consciousness is arriving as arising later. I'm not sure if we can find common ground or if it's just that we're defining terms slightly differently.
Yeah, I think when it comes to a lot of these arguments about consciousness, I think people can get lost in the semantics, or they agree more in terms of semantics rather than what we actually mean. So, for example, some people would differentiate awareness from consciousness, when they're talking
Yeah.
about this pure awareness. Whereas I would say that awareness is included in consciousness. It's a form of consciousness because you're conscious of something. So the pure awareness, which perhaps can be attained, however ephemerally, when we meditate, when we reach that state that people say it's kenosis and there are no concepts, everything is removed, but this pure awareness remains, and for some reason it feels joyful and clear.
Yeah.
But, it's a flavor of consciousness. Um, but I would say that consciousness, and this is where I begin to think about intention and morality, because I feel like consciousness somehow is primarily awareness. But then, because it's aware of something, it begins to have some kind of intention or will, and then from there, a morality can be derived. And I don't think machines have that, because I think we can have an idealistic picture of reality where not every representation represents a conscious agent, but it could represent a content of consciousness, which would be like a field that we all share, that we all are, before it's divided into parts, and perhaps we don't yet understand the mereological relationship between a cell and an organism, or us and the rest of the universe.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yes,
So
so
I don't see any problem with my going with your definition. I think it'll make our discussion clearer and let us move on to the places where we want to apply it. So, for purposes of this conversation, let's say that the primordial phenomenon is consciousness, and it can manifest in more simple ways or it can manifest in more complex ways. And this, I'm going to say three more sentences, and you make sure that we're using the term in the same way, and then let's
yeah,
begin to take the journey that we want to take. So, uh, a primitive form, I think this is what you said, a primitive form of consciousness is sentience, which is sort of a basic awareness. Then we have an awareness of environment and therefore an implicit sense of self in very simple organisms. So, small, very small, almost unicellular organisms. At least the biosymbiotics people argue that. And then we
yeah,
have, in certainly by the time of bonobos or chimpanzees, an awareness of other minds. So the behaviors of the chimp will show, or bonobo, will show that they're aware that this other, say the senior bonobo, has a perspective, that he sees the world from that place. And so if I steal a banana and he's not able to see it, then I'm not going to get harmed. But if I do it in front of him, he's going to whack my ears. Right?
yeah, yeah,
So
that's
there's an
right. Yeah,
awareness of other minds, but not a self-consciousness. And then that would be what's manifested certainly in humanity. People argue if it comes earlier, but that is an actual awareness of myself dialoguing with you as another self, for example. And then I'm sure the scale goes on up from there, and you and I are interested in seeing where that leads sort of metaphysically. But is there a sort of universal consciousness, an all encompassing consciousness? Those are the questions maybe that would be in the field ahead of us as we proceed. But you're the navigator, so where do you want to take us?
yeah. So basically, there's obviously a development in terms of the character that minds can take as they evolve, as they develop, from say a zygote into a fully fledged organism, as much as it can develop, and it continuously changes until it dies, and it does its best to self-preserve. So every life form on Earth, if not the universe, seems to have some kind of will. And then, based on what you said, I'm thinking in terms of not that consciousness necessarily, um, before developing everything, it has to be completely simple. I mean, there is that level of simplicity before any concepts arrive in any animal, but all animals have a kind of will. I mean, even a dog wants things, and sometimes it tries to communicate to the owner what it wants. It wants to play, it tries to get the owner's attention. There's definitely an intention there. So it's a form of consciousness. Even if by comparison to a human mind, it's still primitive. But I would say that perhaps there's something to the. I used to be a physicalist, by the way, up until
Mhm.
2022, and after that, then I I had some kind of metanoia, and at first I became a panpsychist, and then I evolved into an idealist. And to me, today, it just seems to be the most plausible explanation. And for some reason, I found the Neoplatonic argument really compelling, where you get consciousness is the absolute foundation of reality, and it goes beyond space and time. And because it goes beyond space and time, um, it's already, before it even becomes human or any type of animal or plant, it's already aware of its potential. So it's the infinite. So it can be simple, but at the same time, it's infinite, and it's somehow aware of all it all the possibilities, right? All the concepts that can manifest within it, and it can develop different focuses of awareness. So when a human is born, say let's say a human soul enters the world, right? It's one way to conceptualize it. It it's it gets rid of all the infinite knowledge and wisdom that it can have, that it starts with. Say it comes from the Godhead, but it neglects all of that to become just a simple awareness. So let's say the Godhead, let's say the mind of God is beyond comprehension, where it's not just anthropomorphic. It can include all the concepts that make it anthropomorphic, but it goes beyond anthropomorphism, and it goes beyond the minds of all the other animals, and it's something that we can't fathom, and we can potentially come upon when we die. Maybe, and there is an argument to say that NDEs are indicative of that, because people seem to develop a
Mhm.
supernormal awareness where thinking is much faster, they say, or they can read the minds of other people. But all right, let's not go there. There could be evidence for
So,
something like what I'm saying, but when it
yeah.
becomes a human soul, it starts with a zygote. So the zygote is the extrinsic expression of a very simple mind, and then that simple mind begins to evolve and form new connections, because it has to start from zero. It has to start from the blank slate, as it were, and then if because it encounters a new environment which is also finite, and it's like a collapsed version of the infinite. Let's say it's a quantum collapse of a reality that we call this universe. And because it has to deal with that
We,
environment, it begins to form new connections. And as it forms new connections, it makes progress towards the infinite, something that's infinite. But it will never reach
yeah.
that there,
Okay.
as
So
its
let's
yeah, as its
let's hold
limited
off on
form. Yeah,
the infinite and the God part, and just get clear on the starting point, um, which is you labeled as idealism. And I think our conversation is interesting. You held a panpsychist position, and now the way you approach the question is from idealism. That makes this conversation already interesting in terms of the debates of the last 5 or 10 years internationally. Um, uh, and I'm similar. So I have spent 20 years at the Center for Process Studies. That's the Whiteheadian Center with a sort of global network. Their next conference this summer is in China with 350 participants from 35 countries or something like that, partially online. But I never fully endorsed the panpsychist position.
right.
I could always call it quasi or proto-panpsychism or something, but never completely. So that's
Yeah,
already interesting. And the two things I want to point out is that this is um, not identical to theism and a theistic creation doctrine of creation necessarily. It's similar to Hegel, but not it doesn't have to be. And other examples include um, Plotinus in the West, in the Aeneids, 7 volumes of it. He has that same sense of the one in all, hin kai pan, becoming
yeah,
a simple form of created reality.
that's the one
And
I
one
find
of the
compelling.
greatest of the Hindu thinkers, 19th, 20th century, is Sri Aurobindo. And in his Life Divine, he has the same sense of the starting point, almost identical to what you just said.
Right.
So I think drawing a nice, clear distinction between many forms of theistic creation on the one hand and between panpsychism on the other is a great way to let people see how this is an interesting approach, research program, paradigm on its own.
Yeah. And yeah, I've heard of the name Aurobindo. I think I've actually looked into him like some time ago now, and it's something to do with cosmopsychism. And you see, these notions, and also Plotinus, Parmenides, I think I looked into. Um, but it's in general the Neoplatonic thought that I find really compelling because it seems like we are creating theories about reality based on a blinkered perspective. So it's almost like we are focusing on a type of mind which is very narrow, and from that mind, we come up with all these theories, but they're all lacking. Uh, but if we take a leap of faith and start thinking outside the box a little bit and maybe pay attention to some of the extraordinary experiences, mystical experiences that people report, we can arrive at a picture where we're actually being influenced or inspired by the divine. We receive ideas. We think we come up with these ideas sometimes, but I think we are actually inspired by something that goes beyond the human mind. That I'm thinking along those lines, and the thing is, when it comes to morality, there seems to be, at least that's my impression, there seems to be this kind of moral code that we're trying to come up with in moral philosophy, and then you have Kantian ethics, you get deontology. It's almost like we know that there is something there. It's almost like mathematics. You know, we discover mathematics as we go along, and some people say we invented it, but we're really just inventing the symbols. But there is something, there is the maths, which is represented by the symbols, which is something that it points to something infinite. That, and then as we study maths, we discover all these relationships that we didn't know were there to begin with. So it's almost like we're tapping into something infinite, something beyond the human mind, that perhaps we excluded when we entered this world, if we take the Platonic picture to be true. So when it comes to morality, I think we are poised towards the greater good. I know it sounds like I'm tapping into ancient philosophy again, but there seems to be something that we're aiming for, which is almost like a hierarchy of values. And we have this concept of a greater good that sometimes we're forced to believe in because we have this necessity to be inspired by something greater. So it helps us here on earth, even if we don't exactly know how to get there. There's a teleology about it, isn't there? It's almost like if we're in danger, for example, and we want to survive, but we don't stop if everything in our environment is telling us we're doomed. I mean, some of us do, some of us just give up. Oh, I'm doomed. But if we're, if we're strongly possessed by that will to survive, against all what appears to be all odds, you know, the environment is telling us there's no way out, but we don't know because we're only receiving a limited amount of information. We still try something because we have faith that there is a way out, that
Yeah.
perhaps it's not as doomed as it looks, if that makes
What might
sense.
be helpful is to clarify how this position is different from a lot of other positions that are put forward. And then I want to ask a question about what I think is the key distinction or maybe the key criticism that this position would face. So it's clear to me that the position you're describing is not classical theism, which is God creating a physical world outside the divine, and then it gradually develops souls, or God creates souls in it, on the sixth day Adam and Eve get created, and they are uniquely in the image of God, Imago Dei. So it's not just that. It's not panpsychism, uh, as you describe it. Uh, it's not emergence in the classical sense of, we start with the physical world and gradually these mental things like minds develop out of it. You actually start in the opposite direction. So it's idealism is the right overarching category, right? Because it begins with thought or mind or consciousness as sort of primordial in this way of thinking. Therefore, the hardest question is as whether it comes from a unity of mind, a sort of universal idealism, or whether minds emerge gradually into a whole. The biggest question is, are they also distinct from that universal idealism, all is mind, which in the end they become like drops of water in an infinite idealist sea, right?
Yeah.
Or do the units of consciousness, whether persons or angels or divine beings or whatever, retain some sort of clear individuality in the midst of being a part of this whole thing? And I'll just say as a thesis statement, and then I'll stop. The reason why I'm drawn to idealism instead of a sort of physicalism is that physicalism has to work with an either or structure. The
Yeah.
particle is here or there, the law holds or doesn't hold. But this way of idealism allows for a dialectical way of thinking. So not only ones and twos, but also threes. This is both something and also not something in ways that we can describe. And that's like a quantum leap in philosophy and metaphysics for me, that we have a clear, sharp way of speaking dialectically, speaking of things that both are and aren't something, or things that are this and not that because they're becoming in that direction. The whole
Yeah.
world of philosophy changes if you can utilize dialectical thought in a rigorous, testable way.
Yeah.
And so my position, my thesis statement would be that in idealism, a position where we're both a part of some universal field of consciousness or whatever you call it, divine, we could get to that. And at the same time, you have distinct and real identity as a particular center of consciousness. I find that a fascinating starting point and core position in the
Yeah.
in the
So
idealistic
so do
framework.
I, because if we're going to think of God, if we're going to take the concept of God seriously, so he has to be omnipotent, omniscient, he has to be infinite. And in order for it to be infinite, in order for God to complete its infinity, let's say, um, he has to have finite manifestations. And because God is everywhere, it would both be the infinite and it would also be its finite manifestations. And the finite manifestations is us. So we would be, as paradoxical as it seems, we would be simultaneously God. So we have that spark of divinity, but because we're finite at the moment in this spatial temporal construct, we are also not God. And perhaps the best, so I wouldn't throw out Christian thought altogether. Even if I'm an idealist, I think the
Well,
Trinity.
okay, let me jump in there, Arlindo.
Yeah,
This is too important for me to remain silent.
yeah, yeah, sure.
The whole reason that many of us advance panentheism is to get the double sense of in. So pan, all, en is in, and theism and theos, God. So all in God. But it
Yeah,
actually has to be dialectical. It's both true that every finite conscious unit or every created thing maybe exists within the divine, but it's also true that the divine is in all things.
yeah,
And that double sense of in is something you can't get without a more dialectical way of thinking. So that it's both true that we have individual, distinct identities as units of consciousness within a universal consciousness. And it's true that we are also part of that, right?
yeah,
We are contained within, we are inseparable from some sort of universal
Yeah.
flow of consciousness. If you
So
can say that, you can develop incredibly sophisticated descriptions of a number of classical questions in philosophy.
yeah, so in that sense, we would be the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in one, in
Yeah,
us, and then all around us.
you said that one.
So, that's how I'm thinking. You see, um, so we are God, and at the same time not God, in terms of our limited experience as a human being. And with the animals, it would be exactly the same. At the moment, they've
Yeah.
got their own narrow focuses. Um, but it's all God. There is only God. We're God. It's just consciousness. But because
Both
it,
and, Arlindo. It's
yeah,
all God, and we exist as parts of God or as distinct
yeah,
units in
parts and
that
wholes.
universal field.
Yeah, parts and wholes, and felt distinctions in experience, in experiential realism, and because of that, there is a sense in which a part could communicate with a whole. So say for example,
Yeah,
a human
yeah,
being is God as a human being, God seen through human eyes, and at the same time, because the mind at large, let's say, still exists beyond the human mind, there is a sense in which God can communicate with the rest of itself in nature, and that could potentially explain things like synchronicities or
yeah.
people sometimes hear a song on the radio and it seems like the song is speaking to them in a meaningful
Yeah,
way.
yeah. Okay,
And
so
it,
now
yeah,
we're in the midst of really interesting philosophical terrain where I completely endorse your view is the relationship of part and whole. We are
yeah,
both independent parts and we exist within a whole. Again, that can only be said dialectically. You couldn't say that in an sharp either or logic. So
yeah.
that part I like. But let me go back to your provocative use of a Trinitarian formulation, Father, Son, Spirit. Let me use spirit as this universal whole that is psyche, that is psyche, that is universal consciousness. The way that Aurobindo speaks so beautifully of it um, in the divine, in Nature Divine. Um, but then the son, that's any individual finite unit of consciousness, let's say, or son slash daughter.
Yeah.
Okay, but father is the whole understood as personal being or consciousness. And that's where I want to focus in. The follower of Kant's smartest of Kant's students was Fichte. Fichte and Schelling
Oh,
preceded
Fichte,
Hegel,
Schelling,
the
yeah.
sort of universal. And Fichte was a brilliant young man in the school of Kant who got a professorship at Jena, one of the top philosophy departments in the world in the late 18th century. And in 1799, did a lecture which got him fired and ruined his career. Uh, long story. But the lecture raised the question of whether an infinite being could be personal. So, could there be a personal center, again, using your metaphor of Father within the Trinity? And don't think, I still think it's difficult to ascribe the kind of conscious experience, I-ness, that we are talking about here in our idealistic position without a relationship with it with other eyes, right? So you and I and all the people involved in these philosophical discussions are a community where we both learn from the community, but we have a distinct identity apart from it. We're not just, you know, uh, hive minds, right?
Yeah.
Um, uh, an infinite being, Fichte argued in, it was called the Atheismusstreit. It was a debate that's the atheism debate that got him fired. And
Yeah.
he
All
said
right.
an infinite being could not be conscious because it would have no other. It would incorporate everything, so it could not be understood as personal. You could have the quality of consciousness. So for us, the universal system, call it spirit, has the
Right.
quality of consciousness. But but to say it's a person without being in relationship with another person in the same order of reality, Fichte argued, is nonsensical. And I still think he's right. So I'll give
Right.
you son slash daughter. I'll give you spirit, the universal
Yeah.
flow of idealism, but I won't give you the the infinite being who is at the same time a person. What do
Okay,
you think?
so
So I'm following
I,
Fichte's.
I,
I'll
I,
probably get fired for it too, Arlindo.
well, I think people should dare to tread where others are reluctant to. I think in order for us to expand our horizons, I see the argument. I really do see it. Um, so as you were saying that, I was thinking about the Janus principle. So each holon has the principle of where it's capable of looking inward and trying to control its own inner workings, and it's also capable of looking outward or upward at the larger holarchy, let's say. And if we're dealing with an infinity, perhaps it's holons and bigger holons and bigger holons all the way up and all the way down. But then again, I think to myself, but that's a way in which we can come up with a model in consciousness. It's still an experience or an understanding because consciousness also comes with an intellect. At least in the human mind, it's possible to have an intellect. And I'm wondering if there's a version of a higher intellect from which we derive our inferior intellect, let's say. And
So
I'm just
your
not
Holon
convinced.
example,
Yeah, yeah,
your Holon example repeats the problem.
yeah.
Every Holon that is can say for whom the following two conditions exist is unproblematic. Condition one, it's a part of the whole. And condition two, it's not the whole as such. It is a whole, but it isn't the whole itself. Take the
There's
one
separation.
unique holon. It's kind of like Bertrand Russell's set of all sets. Take the one holon, which is the entire system, and not only not a part of it. It doesn't have that double identity of both being a part and participating is the classical word, participating in the whole. Likewise, Fichte argued, God the Father, right, the being who is all, uh, can't also be an individual person. So do you see how your Holon example repeats the problem?
Yes, yes, it does repeat the problem. Is there a sense in which God isn't personal in the sense of um, it's really hard
Well,
for
Tillich
me to
did this
grasp
already
this.
for us, Arlindo. Paul Tillich said um, that the divine is includes all things, um, but is not a person, but quote the ground of personhood. So in your holon example,
Right.
the whole, the absolute whole, is not a single holon, but it's the ground, the thing that makes possible that all the holons, from snails to presidents to
Yeah.
us, are are both parts, and we are part, and therefore we can be a person or have personhood. But the one exception, just like the notion of the set of all sets can't itself be a set. That was how it arose in formal logic with Bertrand
Yeah, yeah.
Russell.
The set of all
And we
sets
never
can't
solved that
itself be a
paradox.
set.
Now we speak of the group of all sets or something, but we never speak of the set because it leads to contradictions. So likewise in the understanding of personhood. The whole
I-
itself can't be labeled a
yeah.
person.
Is there a sense in
That would be
which
where I'd come down.
is there a sense in which it seems like it leads to contradictions because we are looking at this from an anthropic perspective, and we just can't make that leap to really understand the infinite mind of God. So we just have to arrive at the conclusion that it's not really conscious or it's not really a personal mind. But then again, I'm thinking of omnipotence and breaking barriers and perhaps there is a kind of being which is more than just a person, and sometimes it communicates with us in our short lifespans. And the thing is, when it's communicating with us, it's also us at the same time, because there could be a sense in which we already decided what kind of life or human life we'd be experiencing before we were born. And this can sound really convoluted and really hard to wrap our heads around. But then you see, I don't just look at the epistemology side of things. I also try to look at what people report.
Wait, don't go away from the last point because it's too
Okay,
important
okay, yeah,
before you
yeah, yeah,
proceed. Um, so the way that Alfred North Whitehead tried to solve the problem is this, and many of the people in my circle think that this is an adequate answer. Um, he would say that personhood is defined by having some set of inputs and then forming a judgment. He called it concrescence, forming a concrete awareness at a moment of that field that you can apprehend, or he called it prehension. So
yeah,
there's some field, however broad, let's say, mine is somebody's is 12 inches by 12 inches. It's a 12-inch sphere, right? And they
yeah,
apprehend that at a moment, form a judgment on it or an understanding, a prehension in Whitehead, and then that moment of experience passes. At the next moment, they apprehend and form a judgment or a perspective. Perspective is better. And then that moment passes. So that's the Whiteheadian metaphysic. All right, that works for every agent within the universal domain. He defines God as that being, you can imagine it expanding. The baby has a tiny little framework and we have a broader one, and Einstein has a broader one, and, you know,
yeah,
saints maybe have a broader one,
yeah,
so that they're apprehending more and more of reality in each instant and forming a judgment, a prehension, and that moment of actualization happens. I am this being, this mental being who just formed the following judgment, and then it moves on. All right. So then Whitehead said, well, why couldn't you have a being who apprehends all at a single moment, forms a judgment, that moment passes, and then comes the next moment, and that being again forms a prehension of the whole. So he tries to say there could be the divine with this process of prehending or apprehending everything all at once,
yeah.
uh, without this Fichte paradox arising. So maybe you can have your position if you're willing to be a process thinker.
Yeah, maybe. But perhaps,
But
you know how
classical
people,
theism, that's harder.
yeah, yeah, that's possible. I was thinking perhaps that there is a sense in which God doesn't really judge anyone. From the Godhead perspective, there is no judgment because it's just one entity just moving, and we're all as human beings, we're its doings, not
Let me
just
push you
doings,
though.
but we're
Now I'm
moving,
going to
we're
push you
moving.
because this is a really important philosophical point. If the divine apprehends, leave out judgment, apprehends everything that exists in a moment, it has a momentary understanding or preemption or internalizing or whatever of everything that exists, and does the same thing at the next moment, same thing at the next moment, right? Then it's A, unique, because no others of us have such a broad field of apprehension.
Right,
And B, it is a unit of consciousness, right? Because all it's done is to apprehend everything in a moment, and add up all the moments, and you have the mind of God. That would be Whitehead's position. But
right.
classical theism is it is the whole. The divine, encompasses everything that, and is personal at the same time. And I'm wondering about whether that's coherent, along with Fichte.
Maybe not coherent to a human mind, and I'm wondering if it's possible to
Okay,
add up
if you're going to
infinities.
play mysticism, then you win, right? If you can say,
Right.
we don't need to do this philosophically anymore, I just have the sense of the whole as personal, then as a philosopher, I have to become silent. But as a mystic, I might say, yeah, I see the draw to that. So
Yeah.
which set of rules do you want to play? Cricket or tennis?
I
Do you
I
want
I
to, are
enjoy
we, if we're going to do it philosophically, or can we shade over into the mystical?
I have enjoyed our philosophical discussion and the names that you came up with, but at the same time, I feel like there's the mystical, especially mystical experiences that people report, point to something even larger that perhaps we can't reach through reasoning,
There you go.
and philosophy entails a lot of reasoning, doesn't it? And
Mhm.
science itself, we have to derive certain conclusions from scientific findings, from, empirical evidence. And I'm wondering if that's not sufficient because it's in the domain of the human world and the human mind. I'm wondering if that's not sufficient to reach the divine, and if these experiences that people have, especially near-death experiences,
Hmm. Hmm.
when people began to shuffle off their ego, they are not as restricted,
How does Shakespeare
anthropically
put it?
speaking.
Shackle off that mortal coil.
Yeah, yeah,
Keep
that's
going.
right. That's right. So the mortal coil, they begin to do that, but obviously they return to try to tell the tale, and they have trouble telling the tale because
Yeah, right.
to them
Yes.
it feels like they've stepped out of Plato's cave and
Yeah.
they've seen a wider reality. And when they return, it's like it's a bit like this, a bit like that. And the people
Yeah.
in the cave are like, you sound a bit crazy, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm
So
wondering if yeah,
the most helpful way to defend the position you're describing, I think, is in this Greek distinction. It's actually sort of around the time of Plotinus between apophatic and cataphatic. So
right,
a cataphatic expression is one that where you state it is within the realm of words or within the realm of philosophy. We make a claim, we can defend that claim. The
cataphatic, yeah,
apophatic is not an individual claim, it's a sensing or awareness of a whole that goes beyond language.
right.
And so, I think of Nicholas of
So the
Cusa
latter
as,
would be not this and not that. So we can only
yeah,
define
yeah,
what appears to be out of reach from us in terms of what it's not. So all
yeah.
we can use is human concepts, and they are insufficient to describe that
So I could
ineffability.
imagine on your podcast that you're policing discussions and you make this distinction really clear. And so you and your guests are doing some line of speculation and you go, yeah, this is cataphatic, this is cataphatic. These are all things that can be in principle expressed within language. And so you're doing philosophy. And then you come to this level where you and I just came 2 minutes ago
Yeah,
and you say now an awareness that's available to us, but I know that if I express it in language, Philip, you're going to throw Fichte at me, you're going to throw Whitehead, you're going to throw all
right.
these critics. So what I'm about to say is actually apophatic. So
Yeah,
I'm speaking something that can't be spoken. So you can don't call it philosophy, call it an act of poetry, call it a mystical moment, call it a description, call it fiction, whatever you want. But
yeah.
this is what I think is true, though I realize the words begin to turn to dust in my hands.
So even though it's apophatic, there is still a sense in which we can use words to point to something that we can't describe. Is that possible,
Yeah,
do you
the
think?
mystics. Look at the
Yeah.
mystics in every tradition. They talk endlessly.
Yeah. Yeah. And then they say, in order to really understand it, you have to experience it for yourself. It's you need direct experience, don't you? So it
Yeah.
almost comes back to consciousness, really. You can't be told if you want to experience, if you want to see it for yourself, and what you see might not be is
Right.
indescribable or
The
ineffable.
brilliant way that Ludwig Wittgenstein put it in the last line of Tractatus 7.0, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, where he said, Das, wovon nicht gesprochen kann, davon müssen wir schweigen, muss man schweigen. So that of which we cannot speak, of that we must remain silent. So you're it's a whole book, a whole bloody
Yeah,
book. And then in the last line, he says this whole thing leads us to something that's apophatic, that can't be spoken.
that's beautiful. So in a sense, when you mentioned Imago Dei and the critic that rejects anthropomorphism when it comes to thinking about God, that this discussion that we've just had now makes me lean more towards the mysterious, but perhaps not totally ineffable, because we can still access it through direct experience in these altered states of consciousness where we relinquish our humanhood. So there is a sense in which perhaps we can witness it, but then we're at a loss to describe it.
That's it. Exactly
So
that.
on the
Exactly.
scale on that spectrum that you talked about, that scale, perhaps I would be leaning to more towards the ineffability, but not quite. And perhaps there is a chance in which it ceases to be ineffable when we shuffle off our mortal coil, when we shed
Yeah.
the human
Nice,
skin.
nice, nice.
Maybe I mean I'm surmising,
Yeah. No, it totally works. The only stipulation I would always have is that you can't begin writing your book uh, with the claim that this is going to be a cataphatic book. So this is a work totally within the discipline of philosophy.
Yeah,
And then you get to a certain point, and then you start talking about matters which are apophatic, which go beyond what can be expressed. What do we say? Ineffable. But you keep writing.
yeah,
So for me, so I've spent years as a football referee, and those four lines that create the rectangle in which the world's greatest sport is played
yeah,
create a reality. And on that field, the laws of the game of any particular year, FIFA laws, are the absolutes. They're the Ten Commandments,
yeah,
right? Though there are
yeah.
more than 10. So you can't be in the middle of a football game and now say, all right, I'm throwing in a rugby ball. Or now the person I point at can use his hands. You
Right.
see,
Yes.
if you're
Yeah.
going to play football, it has to stay within those rules. And for those of us who think, football is the next thing below God, it is, those are really divine rules, some other commandments,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's
So
right.
we have to say going into a work, and Catherine Keller is one of the best in the world, philosopher, theologian, at really describing how the language works and then to do it. So I
Yeah.
do recommend Face of the Deep, for example, is maybe one of her most profound books.
Right.
So you and I would say we're going to have a discussion. We're going to say from the outset that at the end, it ends in a realm of something that is mystical or ineffable. We'll
Yeah.
still try to talk about it, but we grant that at some point our language breaks down.
Yeah.
How
At some
do you
point.
see where I'm going with that?
Yeah.
Trying
Yeah.
to make
Yeah.
us intellectually honest and yet mystics at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And there is a sense in which language, especially poetic language, can capture more than just prose. And I'm thinking,
Mhm.
um, the concept of Imago Dei, the image of God. I'm thinking it's not that we are replicas of God on a smaller scale, but it's more like we are made in his likeness. And because we're
Mm.
made in his likeness, as finite beings trying to improve ourselves teleologically and moving towards something greater, expanding our horizons, moving towards the infinite and moving to something that we find more valuable. I'm wondering if that's the likeness that the Bible, for example, talks about. Maybe it was intended to be interpreted in that way,
Mhm.
where because we have that divine spark, we move towards greater horizons that we don't yet comprehend, but somehow we know it's there because at the same time we are God, telling a story about itself
Gotcha.
in a
Right.
spatial
So
temporal construct. Yeah,
yeah. So what's really important to me is that uh, we don't change the cards in our hand in the middle of the game. We don't change the rules of the game in the middle of the match. Spoken
yeah,
like a football referee. Um, so we say in the first chapter or the preface, and some of the most brilliant works of philosophy in multiple cultural traditions do this. Sri Aurobindo in The Life Divine is one of the people who does this. So
yeah,
we say, uh, so you and I are writing the preface of this book, much of which is metaphysics and theory of consciousness and all the rest. And we say at the beginning, um, here's where this is going to end up. It ends up with an instance. We'll call it God for now. Other people might call it Brahman or, whatever, ultimate reality. And here's what's true about that instance. Um, it is like a person, so it's like personhood. And I'll just go with Whitehead. Personhood is to apprehend the world around it and to form one's own judgment or perspective on it. Hegel could say the same thing, right? That's
yeah,
that, you remember he has the thing that's external and it gets brought within the self. And in that moment, that thirdness, that is the birth of consciousness in
yeah,
multiple words, the logic and the phenomenology in Hegel. So likewise, we'll call it person for now, is that which internalizes something of the surrounding world and form a judgment on it. All right.
yeah,
Now, this we're saying in the preface, we take that all the way up to broader and broader, more complex units of awareness or consciousness till we get to what we will call God, in scare quotes if you want, which apprehends all that exists in a moment and internalizes it. And then we'll say, now we recognize that to apprehend absolutely everything at once is something that only this imagined center of activity could do, and it isn't something that we do. But that we are going to argue in this book that within a full understanding of the human person is something like that capacity, something analogous to that capacity, but
Analogous, yeah.
not the defining feature. The defining feature for human beings is we are persons, namely finite entities interacting with other finite entities to
Yeah.
create a shared world of experience. What do you think?
I think it sounds right, and it makes me think of the concept of humility because as human beings, we have to continuously improve ourselves, and we can't say that we're already perfect because the moment we say that, we cease to make progress, if that makes sense,
Mm,
and we instantly limit ourselves, and that's not good for us. So we have to constantly have faith that we can improve ourselves and that the way we are is not never good enough, but not quite the limit of possibilities. And maybe
that's
there is
right.
no limit of possibilities. And that's what it means to aspire to God. And maybe God isn't ultimately a person, but it can be a person. It can maybe it
Person
influences
like
personhood.
or yeah, but the word the definition of person collapses when this there is no other. To apprehend absolutely everything at once is not also to be a person looking at the thing.
That's right. Yeah.
Person and whole merge into one,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So we want to say that something of that exists within the human being. We do this ascent, which Plotinus and Aurobindo and many in the Plato in the cave metaphor. Remember, he walks outside the cave into the
Yeah.
sunlight and directly apprehends the forms, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's with across the philosophical and mystical traditions of the world. And we just want to warn people in the preface that language changes as we approach that point.
Right.
Um, Wordsworth in Tintern Abbey says he has this kind of mystical moment walking up the creek bed, riverbed above Tintern Abbey in 1803 and says, and at that moment I was possessed by, that's not a quote, a divine, a sense divine of something far more deeply interfused.
Right.
That's a
I
brilliant
see.
phrase. He didn't say I became God, but a divine-like sense of something, so X, right? I
Yeah.
can't name it, a sense of something far more deeply interfused, like in every cell, in every neuron, in every
Right.
filament of this universe, that something is
Yeah.
interfused with it.
Almost
Isn't
sounds
that
like the concept of
beautiful?
Abraxas or something so
Yeah.
it's beyond human comprehension and it's the force, the animating spirit that moves all and in a sense it's what gives us the impetus to or the will to improve ourselves, to go further.
Yeah.
It moves us. It's the animating spirit. Maybe we could only talk about God in terms of it being a spirit, but not a person. And and perhaps it ties in with the story of Moses, because doesn't he go to Mount Sinai and he sees the burning bush, which could be a symbolic for, you know, it could be the I am that I am, but at the
Yeah.
same
Yeah.
time, I will be what I will be, and the fire could represent the trials and the tribulations that we have to go through, but then the bush represents the unwavering faith and the knowing, and it's also kind of like a flourishing. It's a bush is
Yeah.
like
Flame,
a
source of
branching
life.
off into,
Actually, your
it's
example from Exodus is brilliant because the name that the speaker, the voice from the bush gives, Yahweh, is um, is doesn't really make it's not a it doesn't make philosophical sense. I am that I am, or I will be that I will be. The
yeah,
Hebrew can be translated, but people have pointed out that Yahweh is like an exhaling, I suppose Buddhists would probably like to point that out.
Right.
In other words, exhale, a sigh is beyond words. So it's like Derrida. It's a self-deconstructing name. It's a name that can't be a name. And
Right.
that's exactly where our conversation has led. If the
Yeah.
divine names itself, it can only do so as a sigh.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The breath of life, the sigh, the
Yeah.
yeah,
Or Romans 8, with sighs and groanings too deep for words,
right.
in the book of Romans. Speaking, so it's almost like the divine spirit speaks for us, I think is the verse, with sighs and moanings too deep for words. That's ineffability, isn't it?
Ineffability, yeah. Is there a sense in which God could speak to us? The greater mind could speak to us through conscience, which lets us know right
Of
from
course,
wrong.
anything nonverbal works. God
Yeah,
could speak to us through a sunset, through a moral sense, through all sorts of religious and mystical experiences, and well, through poetry, through novels, through a philosophy book, but not understood as the materialist philosopher who wrote it
yeah,
understood it.
yeah,
Because it's a place where words break down. What did Thomas Aquinas, maybe the greatest theologian, mind in history,
yeah.
say in 1274 when having completed his work and shortly before he died, he had a mystical experience and he said, "I now realize that all I wrote was straw.
Yeah, yeah.
It's worthless."
I think I read that
How could the
somewhere.
greatest theologian speak of tens of thousands of Latin words in such a dismissive way?
Yeah. It's almost like he
Except
woke
that he
up from
realized
a
that the words won't take you all the way.
yeah, yeah. And he woke up from a stupor and then he said that, didn't he?
Yeah.
And I think Bernardo Kastrup actually said that that could be an example of someone who was overwhelmed by the collective unconscious, which he would term as the mind at large. So basically,
Huh.
he underwent some kind of altered state, was overrun with it, and it almost like what happens to the Savant syndrome. When people damage their brains or, when they're autistic, if they're Savant syndrome or autistics, um, they usually focus on things that the rest of us don't, and they have this wealth of information. It's almost like there's too much information coming in because if you see the brain as a reducing valve, it's not working properly, so it's allowing too much information
Yeah,
from the
that's
mind
right.
at large. So I think Kastrup said you can see what happened to Thomas Aquinas as an example of him being overwhelmed by the collective Jung's collective unconscious, and when he woke up from that stupor, he realized his life's work was just nothing by comparison. So he described it as straw. It's something like that. I've read that somewhere,
Yeah,
but
no,
yeah,
exactly. So as we try to wrap it up, because we seem to have gotten to a place that is significant, I
yeah,
think the core thing that we're saying is that one doesn't have to rule out the sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused. One doesn't have to rule out the mystical experiences that are reported by individuals and authors around the world. Um, but one doesn't, if one endorses these kind of, I'll call them mystical states, one doesn't have to say, therefore, philosophy is worthless. The only thing one has to do is to be really clear about where affability, so things that can be said, begin to run out, and where the ineffable arises. Do you have to be silent after an experience of the ineffable? No. You can write poetry, you can tell narratives, you can draw art, you can, live a life of love and self-giving, whatever it might be.
yeah,
Um, but there is this gap beyond which we can't do philosophy because its rules are it must be rationally accessible and criticizable.
yeah. No, absolutely. And
Are
perhaps
you?
there is a
So I guess
sense.
the two of us are saying we're willing to pay that cost.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. And maybe there is a sense in which the concept of God is useful for us to fulfill an idea of God's stewardship on earth or something like it. You know, we can form
Mhm.
a, a, a concept of God which also improves us here on earth and then we can flourish and and it could potentially unite us all if we have this concept of unity which Schelling and Bradley spoke
Yeah,
about the absolute. Yeah.
actually, that's beautifully said, Arlindo, because people could formulate different understandings of the ultimate or of ultimate reality, um, so that we can be pluralists about, say, the religious and spiritual traditions of the world. But none of them gets to claim absolute truth because
Yeah,
all of them lie beyond that point where philosophy rules and a point where one can only speak, as it were, poetically in the face um, of whatever is ultimate.
absolutely. And we can only try to be less wrong each time.
Yeah. Well, that's a beautiful last word.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thank you
for
very
a
much.
fantastic
Uh,
discussion.
yeah. And yeah, keep in touch. And until
Yeah.
next time, definitely.